I already made a video like this, but that was a long time ago, and since then new towers have been added and many reworks or balance changes have occurred. So in this video, I'll be ranking every single DPS tower in TDS. A DPS tower is something used to deal as much damage as possible, usually the singular targets. So instead of being used as early game defense or support, they are used to take down the big scary bosses in later waves. Needless to say, they play a really important role in your loadout, so it's important to know which ones are the best. In this video, I'll be taking a close look at their stats, values, uses, and capabilities, then rank how good they are on a tier list. So hit that like button and subscribe, and let's get started. Starting off, we have probably the most obvious and basic example of a DPS tower, the turret. This tower is just straight up DPS with no other mechanics. It is extremely expensive, costing 6,000 cash to place and an insane 105,500 cash to max out. So obviously, this tower is strictly going to be used in the late game. At level 0, it deals 32.47 DPS, giving it a value of 5.41 DPS per 1k spent, which is alright. But because this is a super late game tower, the most important level is the final one, which deals a ridiculous 429.69 DPS. That is by far the highest DPS out of any tower in the game, and this paired with its impressive range of 26 makes it a really reliable form of damage. That gives it a value of 4.07 DPS per 1k spent, which is decent. It doesn't have any sort of delay before attacking, and just starts dealing damage immediately when enemies get in range. This means you won't have to worry about enemies just running past it, which is an issue for some DPS towers. On top of that, it has hidden detection after level 1 and lead detection after level 2, so it has pretty good coverage. It does however have a really big issue, being that it only has a placement limit of 3. So despite having a crazy high DPS, you can only get 1,289.07 DPS using the turret. I shouldn't say only though, because that's not a bad amount. Also, considering how expensive it is, you'll probably struggle getting 3 max turrets anyways, and after that you can spend whatever money you have left on a second DPS tower. The turret will end up being a super helpful tower in the late game, and is overall just a very reliable form of damage. Its value isn't crazy, but it's still solid. I'm going to rank it as a low S tier, because every turret you get is going to be a really good investment for your money, and it will pretty much always cook. However, it is held back by its placement limit and its ridiculous price. For our next tower, we have the Minigunner. This is probably one of the first DPS towers people will get, and it attacks using a minigun, having a short charge up before firing continuously. It only costs 2,000 cash to place, so you can actually use it pretty early on, and makes it a decent option for some of the first bosses. At level 0, it deals 13.51 DPS, giving it a value of 6.75. That's really good, so the Minigunner can be used to effectively transition from early to mid game. It costs 27,200 cash to max out, and has 157.41 DPS. It has a value of 5.79 at max level, which is still pretty good. It can also damage hidden enemies after level 2, giving it decent coverage for the early waves of follow mode. But arguably, its strongest trait is the fact that it has no placement limit. This means you can spam the hell out of it and get up to 40 minigunners while playing solo. Doing so, you can get a whopping 6,296.4 DPS in total. That is extremely impressive. But that's if you use every single one of your tower slots on the minigunner, which is kind of unreasonable. Also, unfortunately, it has pretty bad range, being only 15 at max level. This, combined with the fact that it doesn't have that high DPS compared to the rest of the towers on this list, means I wouldn't really recommend using this as your main DPS. Still, it's a decent sub DPS and can be used to fill in any remaining tower slots you have. I'm gonna put it as a high B tier, but that's mainly because it's so outclassed. If you're a new player, I still very much recommend getting the minigunner, but as you get better towers, you won't find yourself using it that much. And one of the main reasons for that is because there's pretty much a straight up upgraded version, that being the golden minigunner. It's more expensive, but dishes out much more DPS. It costs 3,000 cash to place and deals 23.44 DPS. The increased price makes it less easy to use in the early game, so it's more of a mid to late game tower. At level 0, it has a value of 7.81, which is insanely good. And despite having to rev up before shooting, it's still a pretty reliable tower since it fires continuously once it starts. Because of that and its good value, it's not a bad idea to save up and get one as soon as possible. At max level, it has a DPS of 222.22 DPS for a total of 37,950 cash. That is some serious damage, giving it a value of 5.85 DPS per 1k spent. It also has more range than the regular minigunner, being 18 at max level instead of only 15. This makes it easier to spam and overall more consistent. However, the golden minigunner does have one disadvantage. It actually has a placement limit of only 15 instead of being unlimited like the regular minigunner. This can be a big deal when playing solo, since now you can only get 3,333.3 DPS in total, which is nearly half of what the normal minigunner can get. But in reality, this isn't really that big of a deal. If you're playing solo, you can just bring a second DPS tower to fill in the remaining slots, and if you're in a squad, you can only place 20 towers anyways, so a placement limit of 15 is actually really good. It also just has significantly better value than a normal minigunner, with its earlier levels being insanely good value. When using this tower, it can be a good idea to first spam level 3 golden minigunners instead of maxing them out, because at max level, its charge up time gets much longer, making it a bit more inconsistent. This isn't usually that big of a deal, but it's good to keep this in mind. Because of its really good DPS, high value, consistent attack, and solid placement limit, I'm going to rank it as a solid S tier, one spot above the turret. For our next tower, we have have the Pursuit. This tower is pretty unique, flying around in a circle until it spots an enemy. Once an enemy is in range, it will then stop in place and shoot until the enemy dies or leaves its range. It costs 3,000 cash to place, and at level 0 it only attacks using a gun, dealing 19.38 DPS. If you upgrade it to level 1 for an extra 900 cash, it nearly doubles its DPS up to 31.01. That gives it an incredible value of 7.95, which is really good, being the highest value we've seen so far on this list. However, I wouldn't recommend spending all your money on this tower first, since it has pretty unreliable targeting. However, I'll get more into that later. At level 2, it starts shooting missiles, making it capable of handling crowds of enemies. It costs 45,050 cash to max out and deals 169.78 DPS. That's a value of 3.77, which isn't nearly as good. However, it makes up for this with its significantly better crowd control. Essentially, the Pursuit is amazing at dealing damage. It covers a variety of enemies, being able to damage flying and lead. It has solid value and deals crowd control. Unfortunately, its targeting is a really fatal flaw. It will either completely miss the enemy or get distracted by another one and let something slip by. For example, it might be locked onto a giant boss, and in the meantime, a bunch of fallen enemies run right past it. Because of this, it doesn't really work that well by itself. I would recommend spending most of your money on another DPS tower that can more reliably deal damage, and then use the Pursuit as a sub DPS, allowing it to deal a ton of damage with good value while not fully depending on it to defend. Still, even as a sub DPS, the Pursuit can deal some serious damage. It has a good placement limit of 10, which means the max DPS you can get using the Pursuit is 1,697.8. Because it has a really high DPS, is able to deal with crowds, damage flying and lead enemies, and has good value, I'm gonna rank it as a solid S tier above the turret. Even if you can't solely rely on it for your defense, as long as you have a couple more consistent DPS towers placed down, the Pursuit is gonna be a fantastic tower for your game. Next up, we have the Ranger. This is a cliff tower which snipes enemies with a powerful rifle. It has a very long range and a slow but extremely powerful attack. It's pretty expensive, costing 4,500 cash to place. This makes it primarily a late game tower. At level 0, it deals 17.75 DPS, giving it a value of 3.94, which is decent. Once it reaches level 2, for a total of 6,400 cash, it now gains a new passive ability. At the start of each wave, it buffs the range of nearby towers by 15% for 20 seconds. That's honestly a really long time, usually being for the majority of the wave. Fortunately, this also happens to be the level with the best value. It deals 39.91 DPS, giving it a DPS cost ratio of 6.24, which is really good. So usually, you just want to spam level 2 Rangers and then slowly work on upgrading them. At max level, for an expensive 51,500 cash, it deals 189.07 DPS, and its shots now explode on impact. The explosions deal an additional 200 damage and gives it a bit of crowd control. However, compared to the main shot, which deals 1,125 damage, the explosion really isn't that powerful. You can place a maximum of 7 Rangers, meaning the total DPS you can get using them is only 1,323.49, which isn't that much compared to other towers on this list. Because of that, you might think it's a bad DPS tower, but that's definitely not the case. The Ranger completely makes up for this with its insane versatility. First of all, it's by far the best counter against flying enemies, as it has the highest DPS out of any tower with flying detection. It can also hit lead enemies, making it a great option against lead bosses and lead balloons, which most towers can't even damage. Not only that, its insane range makes it incredibly consistent. There will not be a single enemy that just slips past it, and it will always be dealing damage. That means it's a great counter against really fast enemies, but also slow tanks, as it can gradually chip down their HP. You usually can't rely on it as your primary DPS due to its slow attack speed and mediocre crowd control, but the Ranger will dish out some serious damage and be able to handle enemies that your other towers can't. This paired with its good value at level 2 and range boosting passive ability makes the Ranger a fantastic tower. I'm gonna rank it as our first S+ tower, and I highly recommend you guys use it. It's seriously overpowered. For our next tower, we have the Accelerator. This tower attacks by charging up a plasma gun, which then fires at enemies. It continues firing until its overheat meter fills up, and then it has to cool down and recharge again. It costs 4,250 cash to place, making it much too expensive to be used in the early game. At level 0, it deals 20.59 DPS, giving it a value of 4.84, which isn't that bad, but nothing special. However, you'll mainly be using this tower in the mid to late game, so I'd be primarily focusing on the max level. For 54,900 cash, it deals an impressive 284.81 DPS, giving it a value of 5.19 DPS per 1k spent. That is a really high DPS, and pairing this with its placement limit of 8, you can get up to 2,278.48 DPS. That'll melt most things in your path and makes it a fantastic boss killer. It also has good coverage, being able to kill lead enemies and hidden enemies after level 1. On top of that, it is a solid 20 range at max level, so it's not very hard to spam. However, its charging and cooldown is a pretty big issue. When charging up, enemies can walk right past it, and against large waves of fast enemies, things can slip by once it enters cooldown. This makes the Accelerator a bit unreliable, so you may also want to use some more consistent towers like the turret. There's also another issue, being that it can't be fully buffed by support towers. This is because the more DPS it deals, the faster its overheat meter fills up, causing it to go into cooldown quicker. Still, it's a very high DPS, decent value tower, so I'm gonna put it in S tier, one spot below the Golden Minigunner. The Golden Minigunner is pretty much just a better version of the Accelerator Accelerator now, having a much more consistent attack, nearly double the placement limit, better value, and only a bit less DPS at max level. Now, for our second last tower, we have the Engineer. The Engineer attacks enemies using a nail gun, and for each damage it deals, it gains 1 scrap. When the scrap meter is filled, it builds a sentry that helps defend. It only costs 750 cash to place, making it by far the cheapest tower on this list. At level 0, the Engineer has a DPS of 3.31 and can place 1 sentry at a time. This sentry deals an additional 2.18 DPS, giving it a total of 5.49. That's a value of 7.32, which is fantastic. This means it's actually a really good option for the early game and can be used to handle the Wave 7 Squire in Fallen mode. But it's not only good in the early game, it deals some insane DPS when maxed out. For a total of 53,700 cash, the Engineer can now build up to 4 War Machine sentries, which now deal 80 DPS each and fire explosive missiles. The Engineer itself deals 82.24 DPS, and combined with its sentries, that's a total of 402.24 DPS. That is incredible, giving the Engineer almost as much DPS as a turret for half the price. It has a value of 7.49, which is insanely good for this high of a DPS. Like, I really mean it, that is insane value. On top of this, the Engineer has crazy good coverage. It can damage lead enemies from level 0, and after level 2, the Engineer itself can damage hidden and flying enemies. While the sentries unfortunately can't see hidden or flying at this level, they later actually gain hidden detection at level 4. The tower also has 6 levels, meaning you can gradually upgrade it as the game progresses. This is why the Engineer is considered a jack of all trades, as it can basically do everything involving DPS. It can damage every kind of enemy, be used in the early, mid, and late game, has crazy high DPS, and amazing value. Getting 6 Engineers will give you a whopping 2,413.44 DPS, and this paired with the fact that it also deals splash damage means the Engineer can pretty much handle any wave by itself. The only thing it usually needs help with is flying enemies, as the sentries can't hit them, and the Engineer itself doesn't have enough DPS to consistently take care of them. However, while this is all amazing, the Engineer has 2 significant flaws. First of all, the sentries cannot be buffed by any support towers. This causes the Engineer to miss out on a ton of DPS, so even with the Commander's 50% fire rate buff, the DJ's 20% damage buff, and the Merc Base's 20% damage buff, 6 max level Engineers only gain 572.39 DPS for a total of 2,985.83 DPS. This is really detrimental, but still, the Engineer's value and DPS is so good that it still outclasses other DPS towers like the Accelerator. I'm gonna put it at the very top of S+, as this tower is just fantastic. It can be used throughout the entire game, has amazing value, super high DPS, crowd control, amazing coverage. It can pretty much do everything. Now, last but definitely not least, we have the newest tower in TDS, the Gatling Gun. This tower is very unique, being the only tower you can manually control. It costs 5,000 cash to place, and at level 0, it deals 28.85 DPS. That gives it a value of 5.7 DPS per 1k spent, which is pretty decent. This tower has 2 modes, one being automatic and one being controlled. When automatic, it has a limited spread of range where it can see enemies, so it's not very reliable. However, if you use its ability and control it, you can attack wherever you want and target any enemy. It can also pierce up to 3 enemies when controlled, which isn't the case when automatic, although only the first 2 enemies take full damage, with the 3rd enemy only taking 50% damage. So against a crowd, you can expect to deal 2.5 times as much DPS. Apart from that, the stats of the Gatling Gun stay the same between the 2 modes. It has a set amount of ammo at each level, and once that runs out, you have to reload before firing again. Because of the pierce, even at level 0, the Gatling Gun can deal up to 72.13 DPS, giving it a value of 14.43. But it's the second most expensive tower to place, so you're not going to be able to use it in the early game. Still, it does amazing in the mid to late game. This tower gets even crazier at max level, costing a ridiculous 228,750 cash and dealing 925.93 DPS. If manually controlled and hitting 3 enemies, that's a whopping 2,314.83 DPS. No other tower in the game comes even remotely close to this amount of DPS. You can solo plenty of game modes using only this tower to deal damage. So even though it's by far the most expensive tower in the game, being double the price of the max turret, it still has great value, being 10.12 DPS per 1k spent. This tower will shred absolutely everything. It will delete crowds of enemies and deal tons of damage to big bosses. Being able to manually target is super useful as well, as you can target annoying enemies like the Fallen Jester or Necromancer. On top of all this, it has full map range when you're controlling it, letting you snipe enemies from far away. This is very helpful for taking care of leaks. There's only a couple disadvantages to this tower. First of all, you pretty much always have to be controlling it, as it's significantly worse when automatic. This makes it kind of annoying to use, as you can't go AFK. But honestly, that's just an issue of if you're lazy or not. It also only has has a placement limit of 1, which might sound like a big deal, but remember, it costs 228,750 cash total and deals over 2,300 DPS. Even if you could place multiple, good luck maxing out more than 1, and its DPS is more than enough. You may think that having to reload can cause a tower to be inconsistent, but this usually isn't the case. At max level, you can fire for 54 seconds before running out of ammo, so the 6-second reload time isn't really a problem. You can just reload between waves. Something I haven't mentioned yet is the fact you can place it both on the ground and on cliffs. There are different advantages depending on where you place it. If you put it on a cliff, you can see over obstacles, making it easier to attack enemies from across the map. However, because you're at an upwards angle, you won't be piercing as many enemies. This is why I recommend always placing the Gatling gun on the ground, as it lets you deal the most amount of DPS against a crowd. Also, try and place it somewhere where it can shoot down a straight line, as it makes it easier to hit multiple enemies. Because of its ridiculous DPS, amazing value, crowd control, and full map range, the Gatling gun is by far the best DPS tower in the game. I'm gonna rank it at the very top of S+. And with that, that's it for this tier list. Let me know in the comments down below if you agree with it and whether or not you would change anything. These videos do take a very long time to make, so if you enjoyed, please hit that like button and subscribe. Also, if you want to talk to me, consider checking out my Discord. We got some pretty cool features, like a custom party finder bot that will automatically pair you up with other people who are trying to do the same strategy. There's a link to the server pinned in the comments. And finally, I want to give a huge shout out to these channel members for supporting my content. If you want to add me as a friend on Roblox or get early access to some of my videos, consider becoming a channel member. It helps me out a lot and I really appreciate it. Anyways, that's it for this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bro, what did they do to patient 0? Why does he look like that, bro?